Good afternoon. My name is Bo Kong, and I'm the ConocoPhillips Petroleum Associate Professor of Chinese and Asian Studies at OU and co-director of the OU Institute for U.S.-China Issues. Welcome back to the Institute's speaker series on STEEP issues, which promote dialogue on security, technology, economic, environmental, public health, and political issues in U.S.-China relations. For today's discussion, I'm extremely honored and pleased to introduce to you Professor Alastair Iain Johnston, with a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Dr. Johnston is the Governor James Albert Noe and Linda Noe Laine Professor of China in World Affairs in the Government Department at Harvard University. He's a leading scholar on socialization theory, identity, and political behavior and strategic culture, mostly with the application to the study of East Asian international relations and Chinese foreign policy. He's the author of 3 books: Cultural Realism, Strategic Culture, and Grand Strategy in Chinese History, with Princeton Press, and Social States, China in International Institutions, 1980 to 2000, again, Princeton University Press, and China and Arms Control, Emerging Issues and Interests in the 1980s. And he's also the editor of, co-editor of 6 books, including Engaging China, the Management of an Emerging Power, New Directions in the Study of China's Foreign Policy, etc. He's published numerous articles and book chapters. In addition, he's won too many awards and fellowships to be listed here, and served on the editorial and advisory board for many peer-reviewed journals and academic programs, including the OU Institute for U.S.-China Issues. It goes without saying, we are very fortunate to have Professor Johnston today. As part of his talk, he will present his ongoing research on the effects of social media on interstate security dilemmas between China and the United States. Before turning the podium to our speaker, let me thank my colleagues, Stefan Sager and Maura McAndrew, for providing the logistical assistance that has made this event possible. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Johnston. Professor Johnston, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kong, and particularly for that very lovely introduction. I guarantee that it's all going to go downhill from there. This is very preliminary work. And so let me just share screens to start the talk. So you can see that, no problem. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is this question of whether or not the United States and China are in a security dilemma. In mainstream international relations theory, there are kind of 2 major ways or models for explaining increasingly conflictual relations in a dyad. Let me just turn off my email there so it doesn't make noises. So there's 2 models or 2 ways of explaining conflictual relations in a dyad like the US-China dyad. In the first model, one or both states would be considered revisionist. This is the term in international relations theory that describes actors who fundamentally want to change the distribution of power, territory, norms, and institutions. Now, why they want to do this is explained by a range of possible theories. Might have to do with ideological preferences, leadership traits, historical memory, and various other variables that might explain why a state is dissatisfied with the distribution of power, norms, and institutions. One or both of these states therefore engage in coercive behavior to change this distribution. The other resists. They become increasingly insecure as one or both try to change the status quo. And this might be called an offensive insecurity spiral. In the second model, states prefer the current distribution of power and territory norms, or basically support the current distribution of power, territory norms. In other words, they're basically status quo oriented, but they're uncertain about whether the other is also status quo oriented. And uncertainty breeds fear. Fear breeds balancing behavior. So building up your own weapons, finding an ally, a temporary ally to balance against the adversary. But this balancing behavior is for defensive status quo reasons. The other state, also uncertain about the first state's intentions, interprets these actions as threatening, and you get this kind of spiral of insecurity. Typically, this model of rivalry is called a security dilemma. Both actors would be better off not getting into a rivalry, but both actors believe that if they do not engage in a buildup of power or coercive capacity, the other will take advantage of them. And again, why a state might be status quo oriented and why it might be uncertain about the nature of the other state could be explained by a bunch of different factors. Uncertainty might come from difficulties of acquiring sufficient intelligence. Uncertainty might come from a perception that the other side is different from yourself. Uncertainty might come from a rapid change in the other side's power. So as we look at the US-China rivalry, it could be, simplistically put, a rivalry between revisionist states or an offensive spiral of insecurity, or it could be a rivalry between status quo-oriented states, namely a security dilemma. So which of these models generally captures the US-China relationship? And remember that models are not reality, they are simplifications, and this allows us to understand the basic drivers or basic variables at work. Arguably, the dominant model in the policy and pundit worlds in the United States today, and I would argue also in China, is the first one. Namely, the other side is considered to be a revisionist state, or the state that wants to change the distribution of power and status and territory, et cetera. China doesn't call the United States a revisionist state. It uses another term, hegemonistic, basically a state that is challenging China's core interests and beliefs about international norms and institutions. So in my talk, I want to ask the question of whether, in fact, a security dilemma model is a better model for characterizing the evolving US-China relationship rather than this revisionist state model. There's a lot of literature on security dilemmas. Overwhelmingly, however, it isn't clear, this literature isn't clear about how you would know when a security dilemma starts. You know, how would you know a security dilemma when you saw one? It's very unclear how you would know when a security dilemma begins, very unclear how you know when it's intensifying, and it's very difficult to figure out how it, whether it's ending or not. And this is kind of odd for a major concept in international relations, that its kind of empirical characteristics are so badly or undefined or very abstract. So in this talk, what I want to do is lay out, in principle at least, the key characteristics of a security dilemma. Basically, what is it that we need to look for to test whether a security dilemma exists? And I'll provide mostly anecdotal evidence for these features. The talk is what we call a plausibility probe. Namely, it's not a full test of whether the US-China relationship is a security dilemma or not. It asks whether it's plausible that security dilemma characterizes US-China relations. It's not a test of alternative models of US-China relations. And along the way, I'm going to draw on certain insights from social psychology into how intergroup relations become polarized. Okay, so there are at least 5 main characteristics of a security dilemma. The first and most basic is interactivity. The actions of one state generate reactions from another state and vice versa. As rivalry intensifies, you should see increasingly tight interactivity in non-cooperative directions between the two states. and cooperative behavior should be increasingly discounted or ignored. So what is the evidence of interactivity in the US-China relationship? Are we observing non-cooperative actions from one state precipitating non-cooperative actions of the other, and vice versa? And I'll just give a couple of examples, a Taiwan-related example. So in 1996, there was the Taiwan crisis, where the Chinese military engaged in large-scale military exercises around Taiwan, opposite Taiwan, in part to signal to Taiwan, which was going through its first direct presidential elections, that China was seriously concerned about the emergence of pro-independence forces in Taiwan. One of the effects of the crisis was, or during the crisis, the United States dispatched two carrier battle groups in sequence to the Taiwan area. And one of the lessons the PRC learned from the 96 Taiwan crisis was that if there were going to be a conflict over Taiwan, and if the PRC had to use force against Taiwan, it would need to keep US carrier battle groups outside of operational range of Taiwan. This then led in China to the development of anti-intervention concepts and technologies, new weapons and operational concepts to try to keep US military power, particularly aircraft carriers, far enough away from Taiwan that they would not play much of a role in the event of a Taiwan crisis. In turn, the US responds to these anti-intervention concepts and capabilities by developing a concept called air-sea battle. It had a number of names over time, but basically this involved concepts and the development of technology to defeat the anti-intervention campaigns or anti-intervention concepts that the PRC was developing. So there was a case that was, I think, quite self-evidently an action-reaction process. More recently, in 2020 and 2021, we've seen a large increase in flights by the Chinese military into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And some would argue that these are largely reactions to, or in part reactions to, US freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait, as well as a increase in high-profile visits by senior political officials in the United States and government officials to Taiwan, statements of support from these politicians for Taiwan. So it would suggest that at least partial explanation for this increase in military pressure on Taiwan in the last year or so is partly a reaction to what the PRC sees as an increase in American political support for Taiwan. Now, this is embedded in a broader action-reaction cycle where US and political and military moves towards what the PRC sees as a de facto one China, one Taiwan policy precipitates an increase in the PRC's coercion of Taiwan, which in turn moves the US further down the road towards a de facto one China, one Taiwan policy. Again, an interactive relationship. And one possible spillover effect from this spiral on the Taiwan issue is more concern in the PRC about the role of nuclear weapons in escalation control in a conflict over Taiwan. So the PRC has to be, or some would argue the PRC has to be able to credibly threaten escalation up a nuclear ladder if it runs into strong US and effective defense of Taiwan in an era of growing US missile defense. So this may explain the purposes behind what seems to be a fairly rapid nuclear modernization program, evidenced by the building of missile silos in Gansu province, the development of hypersonic nuclear warheads, et cetera. Now, these all examples are examples of Taiwan-specific action-reaction processes. But I just want to show you some sort of crude quantitative data that suggests interactivity in the relationship overall. So very briefly, this slide shows is based on what's called events data. Events data are basically news reports from around the world that are automatically coded by AI. IQ's, this organization that does this particular events data coding, IQ's stands for Integrated Crisis Early Warning System. The data are online, you can download them. And basically what the algorithms do is they take all news, or a lot of news reports, daily news reports from around the world, code them into basically what actor does what to another actor. So who does what to whom. And it codes the actions, a verb, it codes the actions on a scale from -10 to +10. So it's a conflictual to a cooperative scale. Now, what these data show in a very crude kind of way, and I'm not making any causal claims, it's not making causal claims about the direction of who's influencing whom when. But what you see is, in general, at least later on in the from 97 through to 2020, is you see in general an interactive process where increases of cooperative moves by the United States are associated with or occur when there are also an increase in cooperative moves by the PRC, and you see increase in negative moves or negative actions also associated with negative actions by the PRC and vice versa. And in particular, what you kind of observe from 2009 on is a tighter interactive process between the two sides in the context of an overall decline in the levels of cooperativeness. This scale on the y-axis, don't worry about what it really means. Increasing means increasing cooperative, decreasing means increasing non-cooperativeness. So what you see is what appears to be a fairly tight degree of interactivity that is declining in terms of levels of cooperativeness over time. Now, as I say, this is yearly data. It doesn't say anything about the direction, who is influencing whom. You can go more granular down to, for example, the monthly level and to the daily level, where then you can start seeing whether there is any lagged effect. For example, an increase in U.S. Cooperative signaling, is it followed by an increase in Chinese cooperative signaling, or if an increase in U.S. Chinese negative signaling, is it followed by an increase in American negative signaling? And in general, you see when you kind of eyeball the data, there is a fair amount of interactivity. And as I said, over time, the overall level of cooperativeness is declining in both sides. If there were no interactive relationship, you'd expect to see no same direction shifts over the last few years in what each side is doing to each other in terms of cooperative or non-cooperative moves. So that's one indicator of, or at least another indicator of potential interactivity. So that's one characteristic of a security dilemma, is interactivity, increasingly tight interactivity over time, and that interactivity should be increasingly non-cooperative interactivity. So a second characteristic of a security dilemma is that decision makers and policy elites should increasingly discount or deny the interactivity. In other words, they, not us, are responsible for any instability in the relationship. So, as I say, the first characteristic of a security dilemma is increasingly non-cooperative interactivity. A second characteristic is the denial of that interactivity, increasingly strong denials that your own side has anything to do with the behavior of the other side, that the other side's negative behavior is entirely generated by its own characteristics. Now, general evidence of denying interactivity that I think we suggest the denying of interactivity is discourse on both sides that claims or implies that the other side is inherently the source of instability. On the US side, an example of this is the rise in the discourse about a rules-based order. So the concept of a rules-based order is replete in American discourse about US-China relations. It's actually a relatively recent term. It really didn't enter the US foreign policy lexicon until around 2010. And in fact, it was borrowed, or was imported by from Kevin Rudd at the time, the Australian Foreign Minister, by Secretary of State Clinton. But the rules-based order discourse is basically all about viewing China as a challenger to the so-called rules-based order. And what this graph simply shows is increasing frequency of articles that mention the term rules-based order in American sources. And as you can see, the total number of references to rules-based order has increased over time. It got there was a fairly large increase in the Trump administration, big jump in the Biden administration. The Biden administration loves the term rules-based order. But what's interesting is that if you look for the term rules-based order and the term China within the same articles that refer to the rules-based order, you find that most of the references to the rules-based order are really references to China challenging the rules-based order. And that's captured by the red line here, which is the number of articles that include both rules-based order and the term China. So this would suggest that there is an increasing emphasis on this discourse that there is a rules-based order and that China is the primary challenger to the rules-based order, which would be, as I say, an indicator of the argument that the responsibility for instability in the U.S.-China relationship is on the China side because it's challenging this rules-based order. On the PRC side, this notion that the U.S. is the source of instability in the relationship might be captured by the increasing references in the Chinese media to the United States as hegemon, or to the notion of a hegemonic threat to China. Hegemonism or hegemonic is a code word for the United States these days. And so you've seen, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, an increase in, pretty dramatic increase in the frequency of articles that refer to hegemonism in the People's Daily, which is the primary political organ of the Communist Party. And you've also seen an increase, similar kind of shape in the increase in the frequency of references to containing China, the United States trying to contain China. So these are discourses, again, that emphasize that if there's any instability in the U.S.-China relationship, it's because of the United States, it's because of American hegemonism, or it's because of American efforts to contain China's rise. So on both sides, you see an increase in discourses about the other side being the fundamental source of instability in the relationship. And as I said, this is kind of a key second characteristic of a security dilemma. A third characteristic is the presence of increasingly empirically inaccurate generalizations about self, about your own side, as benign and not being the source of interactivity, and increasingly inaccurate generalizations about the other side as being malign and the source of instability. Now, these inaccurate perceptions should be held with increasing certainty as the non-cooperative interaction of a security dilemma evolves, as the security dilemma becomes more intense. And this is key. This is important. It means that, in fact, what we should be observing in a security dilemma is a decline in levels of uncertainty about the intentions of the other side. Remember, as I said, security dilemmas start or may start because of a degree of uncertainty about what the intentions of the other side are. But as they evolve, the negative interactions between each side leads each side to an increasing certainty that the other side is, in fact, the source of instability in a relationship. But what makes this a security dilemma is that this certainty is empirically wrong, or mainly wrong. In other words, it sees, or each side sees, a more or less status quo oriented side on the other side as essentially revisionist or hegemonic, for instance. If certainty about the other as a revisionist were accurate, in other words, if the other side genuinely was a revisionist state, then it wouldn't be a security dilemma. It would be the first model rivalry that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So I'll give you a couple of examples of fundamental inaccuracies in the dominant discourses in each side about the nature of the other side's challenge, in a sense, to their interests. So in the United States, the dominant discourse is the United States is a status quo power. China is a revisionist state. And I think you could make the argument that this is inaccurate, or at least too simplistic. It assumes that there is a single order in the international system, and there is a single set of norms and institutions associated with that order. And I would make the argument that, in fact, the international system is comprised of multiple orders. These orders, in fact, have different or have competing, sometimes conflictual norms and institutions. And in order to determine whether a state is, in a sense, challenging an order or not, you have to look at a more granular level at which order are you talking about. So I'll just give you three examples of different orders that I think help constitute the international system. One is what I would call a constitutive order. This is the order that focuses on the rules and norms and institutions that constitute the international system, where the sovereign states are the primary actors in the international system. And so sovereignty and territoriality are the key norms and institutions of this constitutive order. The key institution of this constitutive order is arguably the United Nations. Now, in terms of the constituent order, the PRC is actually a very strong supporter of the constitutive order for the most part, and so is the United States. In fact, every country is, for the most part, very strong supporter of the constitutive order, because the constitutive order's key norms, sovereignty and territoriality, define who the key actors are, namely sovereign states. So, of course, sovereign states are big fans of the constitutive order. I would also argue that there's a political development order. And the political development order, however, as it's evolved over time, is focused on the protection of an increasingly large basket of political and civil and human rights. Over time, it's shifted from a focus on the protection of, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, etc., to include the protection of the rights of women, or the protection of the rights of children, or the protection of the rights of people with disabilities. That order, the political development order, is actually in a certain amount of tension with the constitutive order, because the political development order is increasingly authorizing or justifying or legitimizing intervention in the internal affairs of other states in the name of protecting human rights. In that order, one could argue that the PRC has been a very strong opponent of that order. And that's evidenced, of course, by the dramatic and substantial violations of human rights of individuals, political rights of individuals, civil rights of individuals across time in the PRC. Includes examples of the forced cultural assimilation, for example, of Uyghurs. Another order, I would argue, is a trade order, or trade and finance order. And this order, primary norm is a free-ish trade, free-ish flow of goods and services across state borders. Again, there's a tension there with the constitutive order's focus on sovereignty and territorial integrity. And in terms of the trade order, one could argue that the PRC has, for the most part, along with other major powers, been reasonably satisfied with the trade order embodied in the World Trade Organization as it has evolved over time. So this is evidence, it seems to me, that that the notion that there is a status quo United States and a revisionist China is too simplistic once you start unpacking the various orders that regulate interstate relations. If you thought that the world was just a world of revisionist states versus status quo states, to look at this diagram, you basically argue that if you looked at the international institutions and norms and rules of the international system, that they should be distributed in this kind of fashion, that basically all the norms and rules that the hegemon supports, the rising power should oppose. and all the norms and rules that the rising power supports or would want to push for, the hegemon opposes. And so, in a sense, the distribution of norms and institutions in the international system should be along this axis, namely, the world should be full of institutions that the hegemon supports, that the rising power opposes, and the hegemon should be adamantly opposing institutions that the rising power supports. But the messy reality is that these norms and institutions are in fact distributed widely across all of these dimensions, all of these cells. This is a very simple kind of scattershot. I just thought about norms and institutions in the international system, threw them into these different cells. You could add a whole lot more than I've added here. But basically, there are lots of international institutions and norms and rules that the United States and China both support to varying degrees and for different reasons, but they both end up operating inside these institutions and be bound by them to some degree. And then there are lots of institutions that China opposes that the United States supports. And there are lots of institutions out there that are operating that the PRC supports and the United States opposes or has not signed on to. And then there's lots of institutions that both the United States and China oppose, again, for different reasons, possibly, and to different degrees, but arguably these are norms and institutions that they would prefer not to have to deal with. So this suggests that it's empirically very, very, it does a lot of damage to the empirical evidence to suggest that the world can be characterized by a rising revisionist China and dominated by a dominant status quo of the United States. So that discourse, which is pretty widely, I think, accepted, particularly in Washington, is, I think, empirically inaccurate. Now, on the Chinese side, Chinese leaders have had a long time view that the United States wants to overthrow or weaken, delegitimize the Communist Party. And there's a common phrase in Chinese that basically translates as the United States, its desire to destroy China has never died. And we're seeing an increase under Xi Jinping in some of the discourses about the US as posing an ideological threat, a fundamental ideological threat to the PRC that is consistent with this long-time view that the United States has wanted to overthrow or weaken or delegitimize the Communist Party. So, for example, one discourse is a discourse about hostile forces. This, again, looks at the frequency of articles that use this term hostile forces in the People's Daily. And you can see that its frequency kind of matches certain crises in life for the PRC. Hang on, oops. So the first spike in references to hostile forces came right after June 4th and the massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Another spike in references to hostile forces came in 1999 to 2000, related to the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, related to the appearance of Falun Gong protesters outside Zhongnanhai in Beijing. Another spike in the mid-2000s having to do with the rise of violence in Tibet and in Xinjiang. What we've seen in the last couple of years is a new increase in references to hostile forces threatening the CCP. And this would be consistent, certainly, with a growing view in the PRC that the United States is trying to fundamentally challenge the legitimacy and perhaps even power of the Chinese Communist Party. Other examples of this growing discourse in the PRC about an ideological threat from the United States. Again, this graph simply tracks over time an increase in the articles in People's Daily that refer to color revolution. This tracks the increase in references to ideological struggle. There was a bit of a dip for a couple of years under Xi Jinping. Now there's been an increase in the last couple of years focusing on ideological struggle and presumably ideological threat from the United States. And what's important here is that this seems to be a widely held and deeply held belief in the CCP over time, that the US fundamentally is trying to, as I say, undermine, delegitimize Chinese Communist Party rule. I think this is fundamentally inaccurate, just as the discourse about a revisionist China versus a status quo United States is fundamentally inaccurate. I've spent a fair amount of time interviewing retired senior US officials who were intimately involved in the kind of daily processes of managing US-China relations from the Reagan administration on up through to the Obama administration. What's interesting is when you speak to these specialists, the folks running the day-to-day policy making process, there's no evidence that changing China or undermining the CCP was ever a strategic goal. There was no guiding documents, no planning documents, no talking points, internal talking points, or lists of steps that the United States could take to undermine CCP rule. The goal of engagement, for the most part, in the 1990s and into the 2000s was to create markets for American businesses in China, to pull China into international arms control agreements, into international economic agreements, et cetera, and to liberalize Chinese society in the hope of perhaps more liberalization more broadly, but not an expectation that the Communist Party would fall as a result of this engagement strategy. So the PRC's perception that the US has been consistently trying to undermine or destroy CCP rule is also, I think, empirically wrong. And that, in a sense, parallels, as I say, the empirical inaccuracy of the US discourse about China as a wholly revisionist state. So that's the third characteristic of a secure dilemma, namely increasing certainty about the other side's malign intentions, but that certainty being based on some fundamentally empirically inaccurate assumptions. A fourth characteristic of a secure dilemma is as the secure dilemma intensifies, we should see evidence of dehumanization, or what's termed in psychology infrahumanization, stereotyping the other, denying the other having a full range of human emotions and cognitions. And in the US-China case, this may raise the salience of perceived racial stereotypes and perceived differences in racial stereotypes and differences, and the effect that this might have on security dilemma dynamics. This is, I think, probably the most difficult to study at the moment and probably the most understudied question, and perhaps it is an issue that is less concerning than I'm going to make it here. I'm going to throw this out anyway. I think that the most volatile element in a US-China security dilemma could end up being the interaction of racial and ethnocentric stereotypes on both sides. The risk in the United States is that US racial resentment, which we saw particularly vividly in the COVID period, directed at Chinese populations, ends up interacting with the PRC's tendency to blur the distinction between ethnicity and nationality. So there's this concept in Chinese called refers to the sons and daughters of China, or the children of China. The danger here is that US racial resentment, which is directed at minorities, is central to US politics, and we've seen that clearly in the nature of the Republican Party under Trump. Has played very effectively on white racial resentment. COVID helped focus a lot of this white racial resentment on ethnic Chinese. It helped generate racist statements by US politicians, references to the Kung Flu, et cetera. So that's from the US side. On the Chinese side, as I mentioned, there's this concept of sons and daughters of China that blurs the distinction between ethnicity and nationality. In other words, the sons and daughters of China are not just citizens of the PRC, they are ethnic Chinese people around the world. And there is an increasing discourse in the PRC that the sons and daughters of China, in other words, ethnic Chinese around the world, have an obligation or a desire to help China's rejuvenation. And this graph simply tracks an increase in the co-appearance of the term China's sons and daughters with the term rejuvenation in Chinese journal and newspaper sources. And that increase is particularly taken off under Xi Jinping. This discourse, or this mix of the discourse between the notion of sons and daughters of China on the one hand and rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on the other, implies that citizens in other countries who are ethnically Chinese are also responsible for China's rejuvenation. So US racial resentment in the context of a security crisis with China puts more attention on the loyalty of Chinese Americans. More racialized attention on the loyalty of Chinese Americans then feeds into an ethnicity-based nationalism in China, which then the notion that China and Chinese, the PRC should be in some form or another trying to protect the interests of Chinese sons and daughters of China around the world. This sons and daughters of China discourse then puts citizens of other countries who happen to be ethnically Chinese in more difficult political position, more difficult political status in their home countries. So the risk, as I said, is the interaction between white racial resentment in the United States directed at ethnic Chinese and the claim by the PRC, or the argument of the PRC, that blurs the distinction between ethnicity and nationality. Now, sometimes dehumanization is implied in positive discourses about in-groups exceptionalism. So I'm exceptional, therefore you aren't. And there's a whole theory in social psychology called social identity theory that argues that groups try to maximize their difference between themselves and an outgroup by stressing your own in-group's exceptional virtues. And surveys that I've been involved in both the United States and China show that the more exceptionalist you believe your in-group to be, the more that is associated with more realpolitik preferences towards the devalued outgroup, because the devalued outgroup is increasingly seen as a threat. Now, in both the United States and China, we've seen an increase in an emphasis on particular exceptionalist discourses. For example, in the PRC, we've seen a greater emphasis on arguments about Chinese people and Chinese culture and Chinese history being exceptionally peaceful. That the peacefulness of the Chinese people and Chinese culture inheres in its philosophy, in its historical practices, in Confucius ideas, etc. And this view that, based on surveys that I've been involved in the PRC, this views that China as a country and Chinese people as a people are inherently peaceful and therefore inherently virtuous as a result of that, is deeply internalized by a lot of folks. In particular, Chinese leaders have started using this phrase recently that the Chinese people have peace genes. And you can see, again, looking at the frequency of articles in Chinese media, journal articles, etc., across time, that there's been a pretty dramatic increase, again, starting when Xi Jinping took over, in the system's references to these peace genes that the Chinese people have. In addition, Xi Jinping himself has used this phrase in this slide: the Chinese people's blood does not have the genes for invading others or seeking global hegemony. This implies, of course, the United States does have genes for invasion or hegemony. Now, of course, this reference to genes, I assume, is metaphorical. It's not an attempt to be empirical. But it underscores this notion of China's exceptional peacefulness, and therefore the US as the exceptional opposite to Chinese peacefulness. In the United States, in addition to this discourse I mentioned before about the rules-based order, where the US is exceptionally status quo oriented and China is exceptionally revisionist, there's also a new kind of discourse that has emerged that again identifies the United States or the West as inherently virtuous versus China as inherently unvirtuous. And this is the democracy versus authoritarianism discourse. And as you can see, this again looks for the frequency of articles where the term China is within 10 words of the references to authoritarianism, democracy. In other words, stories in which China is pitched as part of this authoritarianism versus democracy rivalry. And in US media, sort of references to the China in reference to authoritarianism versus democracy began to pick up in the Trump administration. But again, it really took off under the Biden administration because of the Biden administration's democracy versus authoritarianism democracy summit at the end of 2021. But here's a discourse again that emphasizes the US as a virtuous democracy versus China as an unvirtuous authoritarian state. As I noted, this is an example of exceptionalism, and regardless of its content, whether the exceptionalism is about the inherent peacefulness of a people or the exceptionalism is about the inherent democratic nature of a group, it doesn't really matter what the content of that exceptionalism is. The exceptionalism in itself almost always predicts to a view of the world as competitive and dangerous, and therefore requiring coercive strategies to enhance security. So the emergence of and intensification of exceptionalist discourses in both the Chinese side and on the US side would, according to social identity theory, at least predict to increasing coerciveness in their interactions with each other. Final characteristic of a security dilemma is that you should see more policing within the in-group to limit critical interpretations of the dominant narratives. So you should expect to see critics denounced as inaccurate or naive or worse, tools of the other side, essentially traitors. So when groups are locked into competition, they want to maintain the distinctiveness of their identities. This helps mobilize the in-group against the out-group. So there's a tendency for the perceived differences within groups to narrow and perceived differences with the out-group to widen or to increase. So as the security dilemma intensifies, there should be less and less political space within either country to debate the threatening behavior of the other. Debate is replaced by a dominant claim that the other is an existential threat. So the rise of the rules-based order discourse in the United States, or the rise of the containment or hegemony discourses in China imply, therefore, that the other is an existential threat. In the United States, I think we are beginning to see some kind of neo-McCarthyist flavor in some of the discourses. It's not yet in the official discourse. But you're seeing, I think, more references to moderate voices, criticizing more moderate voices as using, quote, CCP talking points. In other words, being the mouthpiece of the Communist Party. We're even beginning to see laws premised on the assumption that if you've had a significant amount of contact with China, you may be a security threat. So Florida passed a law last year that screens university hiring for whether or not people have spent 1 year or more in China doing training, or whether they've received a stipend in China while doing this training. And universities are required to screen to see whether potential hires, researchers, faculty, et cetera, have spent a year or more of time in China and other countries of concern. And the legislation and the publicity around the legislation is explicit. This is designed to try to counter China's influence operations in the United States. In China, my prediction is that if the U.S.-China security dilemma worsens, that we should see more of that kind of legislation in other parts of the United States. In China, the space to criticize foreign policy mistakes has always been narrow. though varied sometimes over different periods. But arguably, it's getting much narrower as U.S.-China rivalry picks up. And here's a simple test. Take the connection, for example, between Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Taiwan issue. One possible effect of China's position concerning Russia's attack on Ukraine is that you will see, or you are seeing already in the United States, more support for the idea that Taiwan is a strategic asset, plus it's a democracy, that needs to be kept out of control, out of the hands of the PRC, which would be a shift in official U.S. policy, which is indifferent, or the U.S. does not take a position over what the status of Taiwan should be as long as it's determined by the people in Taiwan, as long as it has the assent of the people of Taiwan, and it's done peacefully. But one potential outcome of basically China's acquiescence to the Russian attack on Ukraine is increasing support in the United States for seeing Taiwan as a strategic asset that should be kept out of the PRC's control at all costs. This, in turn, is strengthening a de facto one China, one Taiwan viewpoint in the United States that could lead sooner or later to domestic pressure on the U.S. to formally recognize Taiwan, diplomatically formally recognize Taiwan. And one of the likely candidates for the GOP presidential primaries in 2024, Pompeo, was in Taiwan recently, and he explicitly said he supports a one China, one Taiwan policy, supports recognizing Taiwan diplomatically. And I think one should expect all of the other GOP candidates to end up taking this position in competition with each other in 2024. So it's possible that the next president of the United States is on record advocating the diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, in part influenced by the apparent PRC's acquiescence to the Russian attack on Ukraine. If so, then China's current Ukraine position would be a major strategic mistake by Xi Jinping due to the possible effect on US policy towards Taiwan. Could a Chinese analyst or a journalist write an analysis where Xi Jinping is basically, the analysis would be that Xi Jinping is committing a major strategic error by acquiescing to the Russian attack on Ukraine because of the negative impact on the Taiwan issue? I don't think there is the political space in China for that. So that would be another example of political space shrinking for dissenting views or debates about the nature of the other side. So this is finishing up now. This is a plausibility probe of a security dilemma model of U.S.-China rivalry. There's lots of evidence, I think, that's consistent with security dilemma model. But remember, it's a plausibility probe because I didn't test it against other explanations. And as I said, there are other explanations. There's variations of the first model I referred to, where China is essentially a revisionist state, so there's no security dilemma. Or the US is essentially a revisionist state, so there's no security dilemma. Or both China and the United States are essentially revisionist states, in which case there is no security dilemma. A second possibility is that the US-China relationship basically evolves autonomously, or only intermittently is there interactive relationships. Policy outputs in this model are uncoordinated, they're short-term, they're unpatterned, they're in a sense astrategic, they don't take into account the behavior of the other. And this could be a function of bureaucratic politics, it could be a function of interest group politics, it could be a function of legitimation of leaders. Leaders are vulnerable, for example, in terms of performance, so they play up external threats. This is particularly a feature of Leninist systems. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that there are other explanations for the interactive dynamics that we're observing in the US-China relationship. But as I said, this was just a preliminary test of whether what we're observing is in fact a security dilemma. And I apologize for going on and on, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnston, for providing such a thorough and stimulating discussion. While others are formulating their questions, let me throw one and just to get the conversation started. All the signs, all the examples you've provided all point to this downward trajectory in U.S.-China relations that are pretty worrisome. If we think about the different camps, it looks like the liberalists, whether you are liberalist or realist or constructivist, most are probably very, very pessimistic these days. So when we go back and look at the history of U.S.-China relations, it looks like crises tend to provide a role for U.S.-China relations to get better. The 9/11 in 2001, and then 2008 financial crisis all resurrected U.S.-China relations. But in the era of shrinking power gaps between the two powers, is it possible for some sort of external crisis, for example, in the case of the Korean nuclear crisis, or even the current Russian-Ukraine crisis, to play the role of crisis compensation in improving U.S.-China relations? And in other words, is there a way out for China and the United States to get out of the security dilemma, if such a security dilemma exists now? It's
right.
getting worse.
How much time do I have?
I think we have until 1:30.
I was just joking in the sense that an answer to that question requires lunch. So very quickly, I think, yes, you're right that in the past there were crises that helped diminish elements of an evolving rivalry. And you mentioned 9/11, and if 9/11 had not happened, remember prior to 9/11 in 2001 was the EP3 crisis. And there was every expectation that when the Bush administration was coming into power and then ran into the EP3 crisis, that the PRC would be identified as the primary U.S. adversary and competitor. And 9/11 kind of delayed that to some degree. Some analysts have suggested that, other crises that one would have hoped had dampened security dilemma dynamics would have been the climate crisis, and the other would have been COVID. Part of the reason why the climate crisis may not have helped was that there was a 4-year period of hiatus in which climate was not part of the U.S.-China dialogue, right? That was the Trump administration took an area of potential cooperation right off the table because it believed that did not believe that climate change was a problem. So by the time climate change comes back onto the agenda, the U.S.-China cooperative agenda, we are already deeply into a competitive U.S.-China relationship.
Right.
COVID, one would have thought, would have been a potential area of cooperation. But again, in the context of an growing rivalry and other elements of the Trump administration's policy towards China, namely a desire to impose tariffs, et cetera, it looked pretty clear that there were no opportunities for cooperation between the two sides in COVID, and that some suggest was a real missed opportunity. So the one place one could go for inspiration or potential insights into how one would dampen the security dilemma would be actually to go to the Soviet-American relationship in the 1980s. And without going into a lot of detail, one version of the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was that both Gorbachev and Reagan eventually came to the same conclusion for slightly different reasons. Namely that the US and the Soviet Union were in fact in a security dilemma. In other words, the most important step in dampening a security dilemma is to recognize that one exists. And Gorbachev came to that conclusion in part because of influence, at least one story is, in part because the influence of arms control scientists and actually physical scientists who had over the years maintained close ties with US arms control and public policy scientists. And through those channels, interacting with Gorbachev's own desire to reduce the security threats that the Soviet Union faced, led to Gorbachev to basically test the waters, whether or not the US-Soviet relationship was negatively interactive by initially proposing some limited unilateral restraint measures to see whether those would get reciprocated by the US. On the US side, one argument goes, Reagan came to the conclusion that there was a potential security dilemma between the two sides after he read reports about a major US global nuclear weapons exercise, nuclear war exercise called Able Archer that I think was run in 83 or 84. And this was a worldwide mobilization of US nuclear forces as part of planning for the possibility of fighting a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. The Soviet intelligence picked this up and for a while interpreted this intelligence as evidence the United States was in fact planning to engage in a first nuclear strike, war-winning nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. That crisis passed, but when Reagan was apprised of the after-action reports of how the Soviets responded, he was shocked that the Soviets actually believed the United States would engage in that kind of behavior. So this kind of spurred him on to sort of, how will you then convince the Soviets that we are not, going to attack you in a nuclear first strike? And those were the conceptual breakthroughs that both sides needed before they then could move more quickly towards arms control debate discussions, confidence building measures, other demonstrations of unilateral restraint.
Right.
So, is that a historical aberration? Do we have to wait for the next Reagan and Gorbachev? Are there confidence building measures and crisis management mechanisms that can be put in place now that would allow each side to engage in limited unilateral restraint as signals of that each side sees this as a potential security dilemma? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
A question from the participants. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd recently said that the US and China should set rules for mutual deterrence and red lines that each should not cross. Would you agree that this would lead to a decreasing of tensions in Southeast Asia and a potential rebuilding of trust?
Well, I'm not sure which red lines specifically. I mean, both sides have red lines. The problem is that they're different red lines. So the question is, what red lines could they agree on? The PRC, for example, would like the United States to endorse on the nuclear side a no first use agreement. The US view is no first use agreements are not credible. And so why would the United States adopt a no first use agreement? Because it doesn't believe that the PRC's no first use agreement or policy is credible. The question of whether both China and the United States could establish a stable nuclear deterrence relationship hinges on ultimately on whether the United States is willing to agree that the US-China relationship should be one of assured destruction. Basically, that both sides should have the capacity to destroy the other side. Basically, both sides is vulnerable to a second strike. The US under the Obama administration was heading in that direction. That was, I think, where they wanted to push the US-China nuclear relationship. I don't know about the Biden administration. They apparently just delivered a document yesterday, classified document about US nuclear force posture review. I don't know what's in that, but there would be very, very strong opposition, I think, in in Congress and probably in the US military, to endorsing the notion that both sides should be vulnerable to nuclear second strikes. Because basically that undermines the argument for missile defense. And missile defense is a sacred cow in U.S. domestic politics. And so movement towards both sides acknowledging that each side should be vulnerable to nuclear second strikes is very, very difficult politically on the U.S. side. So I'm not sure how one would, whether you could draw a set of rules about deterrence between the two sides at this point.
Right. And as the United States is hardening its approach to China, the space, as you pointed out, for debate, for moderate voices is narrowing. And the same thing is happening in China. Do you think scholars and pundits have really overlooked the danger of conflicts between the two countries and the casualties that we should all remember back to the Korean War and the Vietnam War?
Well, I can't speak for politicians on either side. I mean, I don't know many of them, so I don't know whether they are underestimating the potential destructiveness of a major U.S.-China military conflict. And when we're talking about major U.S.-China military conflict, it would fundamentally be over the Taiwan issue. Mm-hmm. Other issues, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean nuclear issue. These are areas where the U.S. and Chinese interests are not necessarily completely orthogonal to each other, and where it's actually pretty difficult to imagine how you would escalate to high-level conflict over a crisis in the South China Sea, over a U.S. freedom navigation operation where a U.S. ship and a Chinese ship collide, for example. It's very hard to imagine how that could escalate up to major military conflict between the two sides. The Taiwan issue is where major military conflict could escalate. I think both sides' view is that they need to have the capacity to inflict very high, costly damage to the other side, mm-hmm. And costly enough that the other side decides it's not worth using force in the first place. And so that is what is in some senses driving, as I said, the interactive relationship over the Taiwan issue. So China developing counter-intervention capabilities, the U.S. developing capabilities and doctrines that would allow the U.S. to defend Taiwan more effectively. In that context, there's the possibility that you might get this escalation ladder where both sides try to escalate to get the other side to de-escalate. And given that both have nuclear weapons, the question is how would both sides signal the willingness to increase nuclear escalation ladder. We haven't been in U.S.-China relationship has never been in that position where each side has had to signal the conditions under which they might resort to nuclear weapons. I don't think people are unaware of the risks of the Taiwan issue. The concern I think that crisis management people should have over the Taiwan issue is whether each side fully understands how the other side is interpreting their behavior. Mm-hmm. So the U.S., for example, on the Taiwan issue has consistently said that U.S. one China policy has not changed. Nothing different between U.S. one China policy in 1979 and today. And yet the degree of political support for Taiwan has increased. The language that the U.S. government uses about what constitutes the U.S. one China policy has shifted. The U.S. is, reversed the order of the three communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act as the basis for U.S. one China policy. And so it's not entirely clear that the U.S. understands the PRC just does not believe the U.S. one China policy is credible. And that's why I think the PRC believes the U.S. is heading towards a one China, one Taiwan policy. The PRC, however, clearly is not able to reassure the United States that or certainly not able to reassure the Taiwanese people that a peaceful unification process would be to the advantage of the Taiwanese people, because pretty clearly it would not be, at least as currently conceived by the PRC. And in fact, there's a debate going on in the PRC at the moment as to what a post-unification Taiwan would look like if there were a peaceful process of unification. And in the wake of the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the crackdown on the Hong Kong democracy movement, there is now a view in China that any one country, two systems solution for Taiwan has got to be based on eliminating any possibility that you get a Hong Kong-like political environment. So it has to be, it's going to be based on eliminating any space for advocates of Taiwan independence, which means that a one country, two systems Taiwan model, as the PRC is talking about today, would be much more oppressive than earlier ideas about a one China, about a one country, two systems model, and therefore is not at all attractive to the Taiwanese people. So why would there be an interest in Taiwan to negotiate unification, in which case this raises the incentives to use force? So as I say, I think both sides understand that the costs of a conflict in Taiwan could be very, very high, but both sides believe that their stakes in the Taiwan issue now are extraordinarily high. So for the PRC, this is an issue of territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's an issue of resolving a civil war that goes back to the 1940s. For the US, this is an issue of the credibility of American commitments to its allies and its friends. And so if you don't help Taiwan, if you don't support Taiwan, then the Japanese will worry about American commitments, and the Koreans will worry about American commitments, and the Europeans will worry about American commitments. The US got deeply involved in war in Southeast Asia in the 1960s because of concerns about the credibility of its commitments. So the two issues that are most likely, that have historically most led the US and China to engage in coercion against other countries, in the Chinese case, defense of territory and sovereignty, in the US case, defense of the credibility of its alliance commitments, both of those issues are at stake in the Taiwan issue. And so that's why I think it's very volatile, even though both sides, I think, are aware of the costs.
Yeah. On that note, I wish I could continue this conversation, but unfortunately, we have come to the end of this session. So on that,
I'm sorry I went on too long for
I think that's great. On that note of the seriousness that we should all attach to the Taiwan issue and keep an eye on how the situation might evolve. After all, as you've correctly pointed out, if US and China were to go to war, and Taiwan would be the most important reason and probably the ultimate reason, right? So in that sense, I think it's just important that we all keep an eye on the development there, and of course, we don't know. For a couple years from now, we don't know who will be in power in Taiwan. You go back and look at history. There's always a correlation between, crisis and the DPP in government, right? I mean, it tends to be a little bit tricky for China, but we'll all keep our fingers crossed. And thank you so much again, Professor Johnston, for such insightful and stimulating discussion.
Well,
certainly really hope to invite you back when we are able to do this in person.
That'd be great. Thanks very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I'll be back in touch. Thank you so much again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this discussion. I hope to see you in the future. Bye-bye now.